The cries were faint, desperate, drowning. He didn't know what he was pulling from the mud until golden eyes met his, and then he froze. The thing beneath his hands wasn't just heavy, it was wild. Muscles coiled beneath soaked fur, thick with rot and blood. At first he thought it was a wild boar, then maybe a huge dog. But as the sludge dripped away and the eyes opened, golden, focused, not blinking, he saw what it really was. A lion, a full-grown adult male lion, in the middle of a swamp, in the middle of nowhere, and it was staring straight into his soul. He should have let go. Everything in his brain screamed it. His heart pounded so hard he felt it in his throat. He was kneeling in chest-deep swamp water, alone, miles from the nearest road, with his arms wrapped around a full-grown male lion. And the lion didn't move. It didn't growl, didn't lunge, didn't even flinch. It just breathed, ragged, wet, wheezing breaths. Like every inhale was a fight. The mud had swallowed half its body. One paw was twisted unnaturally. There was something dark along its ribs. Maybe an old wound, maybe worse. And its mane, thick and matted, was streaked with sludge and leaves like it had been lying there for hours or days. He tightened his grip, not in fear, in decision, because there was something in that lion's eyes that didn't match the rest of its body. It wasn't wild. It wasn't even afraid. It was waiting for him to do something, anything. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he couldn't turn away. Dragging it out took over 2 hours. His truck was parked half a mile up a dirt path, and every few feet he had to stop, breathe, and pray. The lion wouldn't suddenly snap awake and remember it was a predator. But it didn't. Not once. It let him pull its massive body across mud and rock and tangled roots, occasionally groaning, a low, tired sound, more human than beast. By the time he reached the truck bed, both of them were shaking. He wasn't a vet. He wasn't even an animal guy. His name was Cole, and he laid fences for a living. But there he was, in the middle of the Mississippi backwoods, lifting 400 pounds of fading majesty into the back of a pickup like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was, because something told him, if he didn't, no one else would. The next 24 hours were a blur. He found a local wildlife rehab center an hour away. They didn't believe him at first, thought he was joking. A lion? In a swamp? You sure it wasn't a bobcat, sir? But when they saw it, when they saw him, their faces changed, and so did the atmosphere. 3 vets rushed out with stretchers. The lion was sedated almost immediately. They ran tests, cleaned wounds, shaved down part of the mane. Cole just stood there covered in dried muck, watching through the glass like a man who just pulled a ghost out of the earth. That night he couldn't sleep, not because he was scared, but because he wasn't. He should have been terrified. He should have been questioning his sanity. But all he kept seeing were those eyes. Not violent, not broken, just tired. As if whatever had brought the lion here had nothing to do with nature and everything to do with man. The rehab center called the next morning. "We need you to come back," they said. "He's responding to you." Cole froze. "To me? I'm not. I didn't even." "We know, but every time we check his vitals, he gets agitated. Won't let anyone near him unless you're in the room. He's not attacking. He's looking for you." It made no sense, but neither did any of this. So he went. He expected to see the lion still sedated, still half dead. Instead, he found him lying on a thick blanket in a large enclosure, upright this time, head low, mane cleaned, the massive gash on his side stitched and healing. His chest still rose slow, but the wheezing had softened. The eyes, though, those same golden eyes, tracked him the moment he entered. And something shifted, not in the lion, in him. He felt it like gravity, like old truth cracking through the concrete of routine. He approached the enclosure bars slowly, knelt down, and watched the lion do something no one expected. It exhaled, a long, deliberate sigh, and laid its head down, facing him. The vet stepped beside him. "We've never seen anything like it," It's like he remembers, like he chose you." Cole didn't answer, because something inside him had already known that. He sat there for hours, didn't speak, didn't move, and the lion didn't either. They just existed, together. Two lives, parallel but scarred, now overlapping at the strange seam of fate. The next day he was back again, and the day after. Each time the lion perked up when he arrived, ate more, rested easier. The staff called it coincidence. Cole didn't argue, but he knew it wasn't. It wasn't healing, it was trust. And trust, real trust, doesn't come from training or taming, it comes from staying. And Cole had stayed, in the water, in the fear, in the part where most people turn away. That act alone had rewritten something ancient between them. Not a bond of ownership, not a training regimen, but something quieter, truer, a recognition. As if in that moment in the swamp, when golden eyes locked with human hands, the lion had said, not in words but in something deeper, "I see you." And Cole, without meaning to, had said the same. He didn't tell his coworkers, or his family. What could he even say? "There's a lion who trusts me?" It sounded like madness. But every time he returned, that trust deepened. The lion would rise, wounded leg trembling, and take slow steps closer to the fence when Cole arrived. He never growled, never paced, just watched. And when Cole sat down without words, without coaxing, the lion would sit too. Other caretakers tried. They brought fresh meat, called softly, stayed for hours. But it wasn't the same. The lion tolerated them. With Cole, he softened. One evening it rained hard. Cole arrived soaked, boots caked in mud. He rushed through the gates, worried the weather might unsettle the lion. But as he approached, he stopped. The lion was already there, sitting at the fence, waiting. Cole sat across from him, water dripping from his hair, and for the first time, he spoke. "I don't know what happened to you. I don't know how you got there. But I think we're both survivors, not of nature, not of danger, of people, of being left behind." The lion didn't move. Cole chuckled softly. "You probably don't understand a damn word I'm saying." And yet those golden eyes blinked, slow, deliberate, as if to say, "Try me." That night Cole didn't want to leave, and when he stood up, the lion did too. They walked together, one on each side of the fence, all the way to the edge of the enclosure, step for step. And then, as Cole turned to leave, the lion did something no one had seen him do before. He chuffed, a soft, breathy sound, not a roar, not a warning, but an invitation. It was the sound of presence, of peace, of trust returned. And in that moment, Cole realized something even more staggering than having rescued a lion. That maybe the lion had rescued him too, because ever since that day in the swamp, something in Cole had begun to shift. The nightmares that used to jolt him awake at 3 a.m., gone. The gnawing sense of failure that had trailed him like a shadow for years, quieter now, as if the lion had taken some of it on, just by existing beside him, just by seeing him in a way no human had bothered to. Cole started showing up even on days he wasn't scheduled. He brought a book sometimes, not to read it, but to feel normal, like this was just a thing people did. Sit with lions. He even began talking to the lion more, not expecting a response, just needing to say things out loud. "You know, I used to think strength meant pushing through, keeping your head down. But you?" He glanced at the lion lying there, massive and still. "You're strong because you let yourself be seen, even when you were broken, especially then." The lion's ears would twitch, sometimes his tail would flick, but always he'd keep those golden eyes on Cole, listening, witnessing. Words spread, not headlines, not news stories, but whispers among the staff, the vets, the volunteers. They began calling the lion Valor, though no one remembered who named him first. And they began calling Cole something too, the Keeper, because he didn't own the lion, didn't command him, but he had kept something sacred alive, the invisible thread between trust and time. And then came the day that would change everything. A new rescue arrived, A disoriented, injured cub, barely old enough to walk. The staff scrambled to make space in the nursery, but Cole had an idea. A wild, reckless, heart-led idea. He asked to place the cub near Valor. Everyone pushed back. It's too risky. He's still healing. He's a predator. Don't forget that. But Cole didn't. He just remembered something they didn't. That true presence doesn't need to prove itself. He placed the cub in a smaller, protected enclosure just outside Valor's reach. And then he waited. Valor didn't growl, didn't pace, didn't bare his teeth. He watched, carefully, quietly. And then he lay down, back turned slightly. Not in dismissal, but in safety. Like he was saying, "You're not a threat. I'll protect you, even from myself." The cub wobbled forward and curled against the fence, tiny breath syncing with Valor's slow, steady rhythm. And Cole, standing a few feet away, felt something bloom in his chest. Not pride, not victory, but grace. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't need to be earned. The kind that simply arrives, quiet as dusk, vast as sky, and changes everything it touches. From that moment on, Valor wasn't just a rescue. He became something else, a living testament to what's possible when pain is met with patience, when brokenness is witnessed without judgment. When someone stays, the staff began to notice it too. How Valor never again showed signs of aggression. How the cub, eventually named Ember, grew stronger by the day, always curling up as close to Valor as the fencing allowed. They called it a miracle, but Cole knew better. It wasn't a miracle. It was choice. Because Valor had every reason to close himself off, every right to stay angry, guarded, violent, but he didn't. Instead, he chose mercy. And that mercy didn't just transform the cub, it transformed everyone who saw it. Families began to visit the sanctuary just to catch a glimpse of them. Volunteers signed up in droves, saying they wanted to be part of something that reminded them goodness still existed. And Cole, he kept showing up every morning at sunrise, not out of duty anymore, but because some part of him had healed in that enclosure, on that earth, in the presence of that lion. One day as he sat beside the gate, Ember pressed her tiny head through the bars just far enough to brush against Valor's massive paw. Valor didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply closed his eyes and breathed. And in that breath was every lesson Cole never knew he needed. That strength wasn't in teeth or muscle or roar, but in restraint, in stillness, in choosing not to strike, even when the world had taught you to expect nothing but violence. And Ember? She grew up fast, faster than anyone expected. Not just in body, but in trust. She never cowered, never flinched, because she had learned from the very beginning that protection could be silent, that safety could come from a shadow that never stepped away. Cole began journaling again, something he hadn't done in years. But now every entry wasn't about what had happened. They were about what was happening, a new way of being, of witnessing, of believing. He wrote about how the lion who had once lain in mud, inches from death, now lay in sunlight beside a cub who had never known fear. How Valor would sometimes nudge the fencing with his nose, not to ask for freedom, but to remind them that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering differently. And as Ember grew, the sanctuary grew with her. Donations increased, visitor numbers doubled. But more than that, something intangible had shifted. People came not just to see animals, but to learn from them. They sat longer, spoke softer, watched more closely, because in Valor's gaze and Ember's calm, they saw something reflected back at them that they didn't know they were missing. Gentleness without condition, power without pride, and love that didn't need words to be known. One evening just before the sanctuary closed, a small child stood at the enclosure's edge and whispered, "Is he her dad?" Cole knelt beside her and smiled, eyes never leaving the pair. "No," he said softly, "but he stayed, and sometimes that's even more important." The child didn't ask anything else. She just nodded, her small fingers wrapping around the railing as if holding on to something sacred. And for a long time, neither of them moved. They simply watched, because what was unfolding in that enclosure wasn't just survival, it was legacy. One not built on blood, but on choice, on presence, on the quiet, consistent act of staying when it would have been easier to leave. Valor had no obligation to protect Ember. He had no reason to lower his guard, no instinct driving him to care. But somehow, when he heard her cries, when he saw that trembling ball of fluff trembling in the corner of the pen, he did, without command, without reward. And in doing so, he had rewritten everything people thought they knew about lions, that they were solitary, that they were prideful, that they were dangerous. But here was Valor, disproving it all with every nudge, every glance, every silent hour spent standing between Ember and the world. People stopped calling him a rescue. They started calling him a guardian, not just to the cub, but to something deeper, to the belief that maybe, just maybe, compassion was a language even wild hearts could speak. And in the weeks that followed, that belief didn't fade, it grew. Every zookeeper, every volunteer, even the most skeptical of biologists began to notice something impossible to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Ember began to heal, not just physically, but in ways no one expected. She stopped hiding behind rocks. She began to chirp again, soft and high-pitched, especially when Valor was near. She even started exploring the enclosure, always at a careful distance from the fence, but always with Valor in sight. As if his presence created a safe zone the world could not violate. And Valor, he never let her out of his line of sight, not once. When she stumbled, he was there. When she grew curious, he followed. When she curled up to sleep, he settled nearby, his massive frame curved protectively around her. It was no longer just an act of mercy. It was a bond. Visitors who came to see the lion who saved a chick often left speechless. Some cried, some stood in silence, hands on hearts, unsure why it moved them so deeply. But maybe they recognized something in him, a memory, a hope, a quiet ache to be protected in a world that forgets how to care. And so, a lion who had been pulled from death had become the guardian of life. Not just Ember's, but everyone's who had forgotten that even the fiercest hearts still have room to be soft. Because Valor didn't just survive the swamp. He didn't just defy the odds or endure the unimaginable. He transformed, not in appearance, but in purpose. He became something rarer than any headline could capture. A living reminder that gentleness is not weakness, and that choosing to care, especially when you don't have to, is its own kind of strength. And people responded. Letters poured in from around the world. Children sent drawings of Ember sleeping on Valor's paws. Veterans who had lost comrades said they saw something of their own grief and healing in the lion's silent vigil. A trauma nurse from Minnesota wrote, "I thought I was numb, but this lion made me feel again." Documentaries followed. Donations surged to the sanctuary, but none of it mattered to Valor. He never performed for the cameras, never posed, never roared for attention. He simply remained. He remained beside Ember as she grew stronger. He remained beneath the trees as storms rolled over the hills. He remained long after the crowds left, long after the lights faded, long after most would have forgotten what began in that muddy pit. And in that quiet presence, he offered something no rescue team, no medication, no human ever could, a truth. That you don't have to understand someone to protect them. That being needed is not a burden, it's an invitation. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay, and stay he did. Through Ember's first winter, when the cold winds swept across the hills and most animals retreated indoors, Valor stood outside her shelter, a living windbreak. Through thunderstorms that made Ember tremble in her feathers, he'd lower his head and hum, low, steady vibrations that weren't quite growls, weren't quite purrs, but always calmed her. When she had surgery to repair a damaged wing, he paced until she returned. And when she came back, wrapped in gauze and drowsy from sedation, he lay beside her all night, nose inches from her tiny body, eyes refusing to close. The sanctuary staff had no explanation. "It's like he's soul-bonded," one caretaker whispered. "Like he decided she was his. Not as prey, not as property, but as purpose." and Ember, frail, feathered, and once forgotten, responded in kind. She rode between his shoulder blades when allowed. She slept curled up in the dense fur of his mane, and when unfamiliar humans approached the fence too quickly, she would chirp once, and Valor would rise like thunder given shape. The legend spread far beyond the sanctuary, but what mattered most wasn't the story the world told. It was the quiet story they wrote each day, in shared silences, in small, sacred gestures, in a trust that had never been earned, only offered. Because what began in blood and fire had become something no one expected, a sanctuary, not just of place, but of presence. A lion who refused to let the smallest life slip through the cracks, and a chick who reminded the world what could bloom when someone chooses not to walk away. Because presence, real presence, isn't loud. It doesn't need grand gestures or poetic timing. It's in the moments no one else notices, in the stillness that wraps around fear like a blanket, in the watchful eyes that say, "You're not alone, not now, not ever." Ember and Valor became that reminder, for the volunteers who had lost hope in humanity, for the children who had felt small and powerless, for the elders who'd buried too many friends and wondered if connection still mattered. People visited not just to see a lion and a chick, but to feel something they'd forgotten, what it meant to be safe with another being, to be witnessed without condition, to be worthy of care, no matter how broken or small or scared. They didn't put on shows, they didn't need signs, they just were, together. And somehow, that was enough to change people, not dramatically, not instantly, but deeply. Visitors who came angry left quiet. Visitors who came curious left humbled. Visitors who came numb left feeling. Because in a world that too often celebrates strength as dominance, Ember and Valor redefined it as devotion, as the power to stay when others leave, to protect when you gain nothing, to love even when no one told you how. And that love, unspoken, untrained, unexpected, was the most transformative force of all. It seeped into everything, into the way Ember chirped before pecking at her food, always glancing at Valor first, as if checking that he was ready too. Into the way Valor rose slowly each morning, his movements careful and deliberate so he wouldn't jostle her resting form atop his broad paw. Into the way their breath synced during midday naps, like two creatures from opposite worlds learning to dream in the same rhythm. Even the staff began changing routines around them. Feeding times were adjusted, not for convenience, but for comfort. Volunteers spoke softer near their enclosure. Loud machinery was rerouted further away, not because of orders, but because of reverence, because something sacred was happening in that space, and everyone knew it. And when Ember took her first real flight across the enclosure, her bandages gone, her wings finally strong, it was Valor who followed her with his eyes the whole way, head lifted high, heart pounding like he'd flown with her. When she landed, wobbling slightly but proud, he let out a deep, low breath. Not a roar, not a growl, just relief. It was the kind of exhale you give when the thing you love most is safe, the kind you release only when you've carried someone through the fire, and they've made it. From the outside, they were an oddity, a predator and prey sharing a life. But to those who truly watched, who truly listened, they weren't a contradiction. They were a correction to the idea that strength must be brutal, to the assumption that vulnerability is weakness, to the lie that survival must come at someone else's expense. Because in a world that teaches every creature for itself, Valor and Ember showed another way. Not with lectures, not with noise, but with presence. And in that presence, 1,000 hearts were changed, quietly, permanently. It wasn't just the visitors who left transformed. The sanctuary itself seemed to shift. Children started writing letters addressed to Ember and Valor, taping them to the fence with crooked handwriting and careful words like, "Thank you for loving, and I feel safe watching you." Elderly guests who hadn't smiled in weeks found themselves resting longer by their enclosure, whispering stories to volunteers about long-lost pets or people they'd once loved. Even the most skeptical journalists who came looking for a quirky headline walked away with tears in their eyes and their recorders turned off. Because some stories weren't meant for print, some were meant for presence, and so the legend grew, not through virality but through intimacy, through the way people felt after meeting them, through the hush that fell over groups when they approached the enclosure, through the knowing glances exchanged between strangers who witnessed something too sacred to explain. There was a bench installed just outside the fence, carved with two simple names, Ember and Valor. Below it, a single phrase, because gentleness is strength. The chick and the lion didn't know about the plaque. They didn't care about the whispers or the tears or the way people started calling the sanctuary the place where love lives. They just lived together. He, with a body once broken and a soul forged in pain. She, with wings that once wouldn't open and a voice that never stopped calling. Two survivors, two healers, two quiet revolutions wrapped in fur and feathers, and somehow they kept teaching. Every day they reminded the world that healing doesn't always look like dramatic rescues or loud breakthroughs. Sometimes healing is soft and steady. Sometimes it curls up beside you in the night or watches your shadow under the sun. Sometimes it chirps. Sometimes it simply stays. Ember would sometimes nestle beneath Valor's mane, disappearing almost entirely in his fur, her tiny heartbeat tapping against his jugular like a distant drum. And he, this giant once feared and fractured, would bow his head as if listening. Not to the rhythm, but to the meaning. Because what they had created together wasn't just recovery, it was redefinition of who gets to protect, of who's worth saving, of what love looks like when it isn't demanded but discovered. Caretakers noticed it first, the way other animals seemed calmer near them. How even the more aggressive rescues quieted down as they passed Valor's pen. As if that space had become more than just an enclosure, as if something holy had settled in the straw and dirt. Visitors stopped using words like odd or miracle. They started saying right. This feels right. And in a world so often marked by what is broken and cruel, the lion and the chick, without ever trying, offered a different story. Not about survival, but about sanctuary. Not about instinct, but about intention. Not about who was stronger, but about who was softer and why that mattered more. Because in a world that often rewards sharpness and speed, there was something quietly radical about stillness, about choosing not to react with fear, about staying when everything in your past has taught you to run. Valor had once known pain as a constant. He had flinched at every sound, braced for every approach, trusted no hand that reached out. But now he stood unmoved, not because he had forgotten, but because he had forgiven. Not the ones who hurt him, but the fear itself. And Ember, too small to fight, had never tried. She didn't need to. She brought change not through force, but through presence. Her innocence wasn't naivety, it was insistence. That safety was possible, that love could be mirrored, not just given. The two of them, lion and chick, became more than companions. They became a symbol, a still point in a turning world. A question that lingered in the air for every visitor. What if gentleness isn't weakness, but wisdom? And the longer they stayed together, the more that answer became obvious. Because there, under the golden dusk light, you could watch her hop forward and preen his fur with tiny, almost ridiculous care. You could watch him lower his massive head until it touched hers, eyes closed in a trust that once seemed impossible. And something in you would shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but undeniably, like a thread pulled from somewhere deep, something you'd forgotten you believed in. And it wasn't about animals anymore. It was about all of us. Because watching them, this unlikely pair, the predator and the fragile, was like watching a promise unfold. Not one that was spoken, but one that had been buried inside every human heart since the beginning. The belief that gentleness can survive anything, even fire, even teeth, even the kind of loneliness that scars the soul. People began coming not just to see, but to sit. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence around Valor and Ember had a shape, a gravity. It invited reflection. It asked you to notice what the world often rushes past: small kindnesses, brave stillness, quiet resilience. And it changed people. A soldier on leave sat by their enclosure for hours, tears on his face without shame. A child who hadn't spoken in 6 months whispered her first word: lion. A woman mourning her father left a feather from his hat on the ground by the fence, and for a moment the wind stilled. Caretakers stopped using locks at night. They didn't need to. Valor stayed because Ember did, and Ember stayed because the world, for once, had chosen not to take. What began as a rescue had become a sanctuary. What began with fire had led to warmth, and what began with pain had opened the door to something rare. Not a story of survival, but a testament to grace. Because grace isn't loud. It doesn't beg for attention or come with grand gestures. It shows up in quiet choices, in a lion choosing not to leave, in a chick resting beneath the curve of his jaw, in the decision to stay soft in a world that tried to harden you. Grace is what happens when you carry your wounds not as warnings, but as offerings. Valor didn't become gentle because he forgot the pain. He became gentle because Ember reminded him that pain wasn't the only truth, that somewhere beneath the scars and muscle, there was still something worth protecting. Not out of duty, but out of love. And Ember, she didn't need to roar. She didn't need claws. She just needed to show up day after day with that absurd chirp and that tiny flutter of feathers. And that was enough. She taught the lion, and through him, the world, that presence is its own kind of power. Visitors began leaving behind more than feathers and flowers. They left behind apologies, letters to estranged siblings, notes that said, "I'm trying." And those notes were never collected or published. They were just placed quietly by the fence, where they could be forgotten by the world but remembered by something greater. Because somehow in the stillness between a lion and a chick, people were finding themselves again, not the selves they performed, but the selves they'd hidden. And so, when Valor finally closed his eyes for the last time, many seasons later, old and surrounded by people who had once feared him, he wasn't alone. Ember was curled beneath his chin, just like the first day. There was no grand announcement, no headlines, just a sunrise that seemed to pause a little longer, a hush among the trees, and 100 people standing silently by the fence, not to mourn a lion, but to honor a legacy. Because Valor didn't just survive cruelty, he transformed it. He taught us that mercy isn't weakness, that strength doesn't need to roar, and that love, real love, isn't loud. It's steady, it stays. And Ember? She lived on. Not in fear, not in a cage, but in the garden that grew beside Valor's resting place. Caretakers say she still chirps at dusk, still waits by the fence when the sky begins to darken. Not for protection, but to remind anyone watching that compassion, once given, never truly leaves. It echoes. In every quiet act of care, in every decision to stay, in every moment we choose presence over performance. Because once, in a broken world, a lion chose to kneel, and the smallest creature dared to stand beside him. If this story touched your heart, share it, because sometimes the strongest bonds are built in silence, and the bravest acts come from those we least expect.